The Galactic Council judged humanity. They never spoke again. The broadcast sphere in the Accord Vault had gone dark 41 times in recorded Council history. 39 were technical failures. Once was an assassination. This time it was a vote. Sera Voss did not look away from the black screen. Her hands lay flat on the table in front of her, palms down, the way she positioned them when she was about to say something final, except she had already said it. The word that mattered was sovereignty. She had stopped at exactly that word, and the sphere had died 41 milliseconds later. Not a glitch, a cut. The Accord Vault held 47 delegate stations, arranged in concentric rings around the dead broadcast sphere. No one moved. The species in this chamber had spent 3 centuries learning that silence after a severed broadcast meant something was about to be official. Grand Arbiter Sorvin Dahl sat in the elevated arbiter's seat, his 6-limbed frame compressed into the formal coil that signaled procedural restraint. His bioluminescent chromatophore patches, the rare tri-stripe marking that identified him as hereditary arbiter, held amber neutral. Perfect composure. He had presided over 23 treaty suspensions without once showing the color shift that indicated strain. He raised the gavel. The broadcast was technical, he said. The envoy's sentence stands as incomplete. Recognizing the administrative necessity, I move for immediate session recess. Council will reconvene in 1 hour for formal vote on the suspension of human treaty status under Section 41, Clause 9 of the Galactic Accord. The gavel fell. The seal on Sera Voss's data slate changed color from gold to gray, active to suspended. The color shift took 3 seconds. She watched it happen. Her hands did not move. Around the chamber, delegates consulted with their staff. The Oreth Conclave's economic calculator was already running. The Varathi representative made a note in the deep archive format, careful handwriting, the kind that lasted. A Thurvek administrative assistant approached Dahl and whispered something that made the tri-stripe patches flicker toward violet before settling back to amber. Voss did not rise. She sat in her seat and watched the sphere stay black. Across the chamber in the observation gallery above the ringed platforms, a junior diplomatic aide named Thren Human, quiet, assigned to Voss's office 3 months ago, began the notification sequence. It took 42 seconds. The message was simple, broadcast interrupted at mark, proceeding as planned. The message went to exactly one location, a maintenance corridor in a building with no official name, in a sector that appeared on no public directory, 74,000 kilometers away, in a room with no windows and walls soundproof to the point where Marin Saul could hear her own heartbeat if she stopped moving. Intelligence Director Saul received the message on a screen that was not networked to anything the Council had ever scanned. She read it once, she closed her eyes, she opened them. They cut her, she said. Across the table from her sat 34 human intelligence officers, arranged by sector assignment, each one with a slate in front of them, each one watching her because this was the moment they had spent 11 years building toward. And if Saul's next words were wrong, the architecture fell apart. She did not hesitate. Activate Greywater. The code that went out from that room traveled through 17 disconnected human networks, each one isolated from the others, each one capable of functioning alone. Within 40 seconds, every human vessel in known space received a single instruction. All transponders went silent. All diplomatic traffic halted. All civilian trade coordination ceased. The fleets that were supposed to be scattered across 3 dozen human settlements stopped transmitting. From the perspective of any external observer, humanity had simply stopped answering. Marin Saul leaned back in her chair. She did not move again for 16 hours. She watched the feeds, watched the Thurvek responses, watched the deployment orders start to flow. And she waited, because waiting was the architecture, and the architecture had no room for impatience. In the Varathi Deep Archive, buried 40 meters below ground in a space where the humming of data cores had become so constant that silence would have felt like a wound, Analyst Kesmora of the 47th generational line pulled a single data slate from the inactive file section. The slate was gray-backed, unmarked by any official seal. It contained 30 cycles of human technology reports, each one marked minor significance. each one reviewed and cleared by the classification committee. She began pulling the underlying research papers. The first one took her 3 minutes to locate, a human research frigate officially. The underlying design specs described something else. A vessel with weapons-grade architecture hidden under merchant configuration, a dreadnought sensor suite compressed into a frigate's frame, the kind of ship you built when you wanted to learn how something larger should move. She pulled the second report, a mining vessel officially. The research paper described a fleet yard construction platform, not for mining, for building other ships. By the third report, her secondary eyelids had closed into the horizontal reading position, the position her colleagues called the reading face, the one that meant she was in pattern recognition and would not be coming back until the pattern resolved. The humming of the data cores continued around her, unchanged, constant, the sound of information at rest. She was about to find out what information at war looked like. The Thurvec Dominion's interpretation of humanity's silence came in 2 phases. Phase 1 lasted 12 hours. The interpretation was technical failure. Something had disrupted human communications infrastructure, a solar event perhaps, or sabotage from within their own settlements. Salvage crews were authorized and dispatched. The Dominion had not become majority arbiters of the Galactic Council by failing to capitalize on structural collapse. Phase 2 began when the salvage crews arrived at the first human trade yard and found it empty, maintained, and locked down with precision that suggested abandonment by choice rather than by panic. Dahl permitted himself a smile in a closed session, controlled, procedurally appropriate, the smile of someone who had been right about the brittleness of human institutional capacity, the smile of someone who had read the strength profile correctly and found it wanting. He drafted a formal statement. The Dominion moves to assist in the stabilization of formerly human-administered territories under emergency clause provision. All human settlements will be brought into Thurvec administrative custody for operational continuity and civilian protection. The language was perfect, impeccable. It could have been mistaken for charity. It was the language that would hold up in the archive. That was all that mattered. Kesmora pulled satellite data on human orbital stations. She was on her 7th overlay when the gravitational anomalies resolved into something that made her hands start to shake. Not an obvious fleet, not vessels broadcasting identification signatures or using conventional drive signatures, just the fold space distortions that heavy mass leaves behind, the way space wrinkles when you fold a thing into it and hold it there without letting the fold flatten. The absence of signal in regions of space that should carry civilian trade chatter. The silence that only exists when the people who should be making noise have decided not to. She ran the mass calculation 3 times, because the first 2 numbers could not be accurate. 14,000 vessels, not positioned to defend human worlds, positioned at every critical node of the Thurvec Dominion's logistical chain, the fleet yards, the shipyards, the weapons platforms, the supply corridors. Positioned by someone who had studied Thurvec war doctrine long enough to know exactly where the Dominion would hurt most if it tried to hurt at all. She did not move for 47 seconds after the number resolved. Then she began documenting, because if this moment was about to become history, someone needed to make sure the archive was accurate. Her hands had stopped shaking by the time the notification arrived 72 hours later. The notification arrived at Kesmora's station at 14:47 Council Standard Time. It was not routed through official channels. It came in on the Varathi Archive's internal notification system, the one that historians used when they were flagging documents for urgent reclassification, which meant someone at the Human Intelligence Coordination Center had learned long ago how to make something important sound routine. All personnel safe, all facilities intact, custody transferred under protocol authority. Message follows. Kesmora's hands moved to the archive controls before her conscious mind had finished parsing the syntax. She pulled the deep space sensor logs again. This time she looked at timestamps. This time she looked for the moment when the fold space signatures changed from passive holding to active deployment. The moment was exactly 72 hours after the broadcast died. She did not look up from her station. She did not notify her supervisor. She simply pulled the next layer of data and watched the shadow of 14,000 vessels resolve from fold space into normal space coordinates. Not in a defensive posture, around human territory. At the fleet yards, the shipyards, the weapons platforms, the supply corridors, every critical node where a war machine requires maintenance, resupply, and command coordination. The Dominion's war machine, held now by people who had studied the architecture carefully enough to know where to stand so that nothing could move without permission. In the Accord Vault, the recess lasted exactly 1 hour. Sera Voss spent it in the delegation office, a small room off the main chamber where human staff could coordinate. She did not check communications. She did not pull up the feeds from human space. She sat at the table, hands flat on its surface, and waited. Her aide, Thren, entered at the 59-minute mark. He had the look of someone who had just verified that something impossible had happened exactly as planned. "Message received?" she asked. "At mark," he said. She nodded. She stood. She adjusted her ceremonial collar, a small, precise motion, and walked back into the Accord Vault. Dahl was already in the arbiter's seat. His chromatophore patches held amber neutral. He was executing the procedural shutdown of humanity's last protection in the Council, with the same composure he had maintained for 23 treaty suspensions. The gavel fell, the vote was called, the result was recorded. Humanity's treaty status was suspended, effective immediately under Section 41, Clause 9. All human settlements reclassified as unclaimed territory. All human trade access revoked. All human diplomatic privileges nullified. The vote was 38-6 in favor of suspension. The 6 abstentions were the Varathi, who did not vote on matters of political status without precedent review, the Orath Conclave, who were recalculating the economic implications, and 4 smaller species who had abstained from everything since the Dominion had quietly made it clear that was safer. Voss did not speak. She watched the seal on her data slate change from gold to gray. The color shift took 3 seconds. She watched it happen. When it was complete, she rose, gathered her materials with the same precision she had sat with them, and walked out of the Accord Vault. No protest, no plea, no request for reconsideration. Just the sound of her footsteps across the polished floor, and then the sound of the doors closing behind her. Dahl sat in the elevated seat and allowed his composure to settle deeper. The crisis had passed. Procedure had held. The human problem had been managed through institutional frameworks that the Dominion had spent 60 years constructing. He permitted himself the small internal satisfaction of a calculation that had come out correct. That was when his administrative attaché, Rithvar 7, approached with a message slate. The attaché's expressions never changed, which was the only reason Dahl trusted him. A being with consistent affect could not accidentally reveal something in a moment of shock. The human fleet yards report loss of all external command authority, Rithvar 7 said. The shipyards report the same. Weapons platforms across the Dominion space are registering as under external custody. Communications from human vessels are formal and unarmed. Dahl processed this information. He processed it again. He set the information aside and processed it a 3rd time because the first 2 passes had not produced a coherent response. "How long?" he asked. 47 minutes, Rithvar 7 said. "The operation is complete." The chromatophore patches on Dahl's mantle were not under conscious control. They had evolved to display emotional states that his language could not easily express. They shifted now from amber neutral to a color that his medical staff would later classify as unprecedented in a formal setting. Not the violet red of controlled emotion, but something between. The color of an equation that had returned the wrong answer. Kesmora's hands were shaking by the 3rd data overlay. Not because the numbers were wrong, because they were right, and no one had noticed for 30 years. She pulled the first technology report from 30 cycles ago. She pulled the underlying research. The delta between what had been reported and what had been researched was not an error. It was consistent, sustained, a form of communication that answered the exact question asked while never volunteering the answer to the question not asked. The 2nd report confirmed it, the 3rd, the 4th. By the seventh overlay, she understood that she was looking at a doctrine, a systematic, deliberate, sustained underreporting of human capability, conducted over 3 decades, by people who had been paying attention to where the Galactic Council's attention was not looking. She began to compose the formal archive record. Her hand stopped shaking as soon as she started writing, because documentation was the only form of bearing witness that the archive recognized. The message that came across her notification system did not interrupt her work. It simply confirmed it. All facilities in Dominion space are secure and under human custody. All personnel have been evacuated. All wounded are being treated. The new charter will be presented for ratification within the standard review period. We are not your enemy. We are your proof. Kesmora set down her documentation slate. She pulled up the archive access logs for the 30 years of reports she had been analyzing. She began the process of formally entering each one into the permanent record, not as minor significance, but as the evidence of a doctrine that had stood for 30 years, waiting. The archive would know. The archive would remember. The archive would be accurate. The Thurvec Dominion's response came through the formal channel that had been designed to manage crises within institutional frameworks. There was an emergency session. There was a recess. There was a closed-door negotiation that lasted 11 hours and produced a new charter, drafted in perfect procedural language, that negated the prior suspension and installed new safeguards. No supermajority treaty suspension without independent external arbitration. No delegate silence during formal session. All violations entered into the Galactic Archive permanently. The Dominion voted in favor. Because the alternative, allowing the current situation to become the permanent status quo, was worse than accepting new rules. The vote passed. The new charter was certified. The seal on Sera Voss's data slate turned from gray to gold. She did not speak during any of this. She sat in her seat in the Accord vault, her hands flat on the table, her data slate in front of her with the seal burning gold. When the session ended, she remained seated while other delegates gathered their materials and filed out. Thren approached her. "The notification came through," he said. "Everything is secure." "I know," she said. "Do you want to respond?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "No, I want to sit here until they notice I'm still here." She was still sitting when the broadcast began. The Accord Vault's central sphere flickered to life, not with the usual delegate recognition protocol, but with a direct feed from deep space. Raw, unmediated. The kind of broadcast that only happened when one party wanted the entire council to watch something that could not be filtered through procedural language. The feed showed the Thurvec fleet yards at Sector 7. The image was tight enough that individual dock structures were visible. The timestamp read 0000 in fleet coordination time. The operation had not yet begun. Sera Voss did not move. She kept her hands flat on the table. Her data slate lay in front of her with the gold seal facing up. She was looking at the sphere, but her expression gave nothing away. Dahl was looking at the sphere too. His elevated seat put him at the highest point in the chamber, which meant every delegate could see his face without turning, which also meant that when his chromatophore patches began to shift, they had an unobstructed view. From amber neutral to something between. The first Fleet Yard facility went dark on the broadcast at Mark 0003. Not destroyed. The structure was still visible in the darkness. The power systems had simply ceased to function. The docking arms folded into maintenance position. The umbilical lines to the central hub disconnected in a sequence that took 42 seconds. A sequence that could only be executed by someone who had studied the yard's internal architecture. By someone who had the access codes. Dahl's patches shifted deeper, still not violet red, but closer. "What is happening?" a delegate asked. It was Rithvar 7, Dahl's own administrative attaché, speaking from his position at the lower ring. No one answered. The broadcast continued. The second facility went dark at 0047. The third at 0133. By the fourth, the pattern was undeniable, not random destruction but systematic shutdown, calculated, precise. the work of an intelligence architecture that had spent 30 years learning where every switch was. Kesmora, watching the same feed from the deep archive 40 meters below ground, understood what she was seeing before anyone else in the chamber did. She understood because she had just finished pulling the data that explained it. She understood because she had spent 3 days tracing the shadow of this moment through 30 cycles of technology reports. The Thurvik fleet yards were not being attacked. They were being demonstrated. The broadcast showed 6 fleet yards in sequence. The message with each one was identical, intact, maintained, locked, controlled by someone else. By the time the 7th facility registered the handoff to human custody, the Accord vault had fallen into the kind of silence that only happens when an entire room understands that the frame they had been operating inside has shifted. 47 minutes. That was the total duration of the operation. 47 minutes from the first facility shutdown to the final message transmission. All personnel safe, all facilities intact, under human custody, awaiting new charter. In those 47 minutes, 14,000 vessels emerged from fold space at predetermined coordinates. 6 shipyards registered into human inventory. 47 weapons platforms went into maintenance lockdown. 3,200 warships powered down their independent command authority. Every Thurvik military personnel in the affected sectors was evacuated by human crews who had trained for this scenario for longer than any of them had been alive. Dahl watched all of it. His patches had shifted to a color that had no name in Thurvik medical classification, the rarest occurrence in the entire recorded history of the arbiter position. He could not maintain his composure, not because of the magnitude of what was happening, but because of what it meant. He had authorized a vote based on incomplete data. He had executed a procedural maneuver based on the assumption that procedure had meaning. He had believed that institutional form could constrain institutional power, and he had been wrong in a way that could not be corrected through procedure, because the other party had simply chosen to step outside the frame. The message that came with the final handoff was 4 sentences. Voss read it from her position in the chamber. Her data slate displayed it in real time. She did not read it aloud. She simply sat, her hands flat on the table, and watched it land. All personnel are safe. All facilities are intact. We will maintain custody until a new charter is ratified. We are not your enemy. We are your proof. The last sentence was not a statement of intent. It was not a threat. It was a fact, a demonstration, a piece of information that the archive would carry forward. When the broadcast ended, when the sphere went dark and the Accord vault settled back into its normal lighting, no one moved. Voss did not move. Dahl did not move. The 47 delegates from 5 dozen species did not move. The silence in that chamber was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a calculation that had returned an unexpected result. Kesmora composed the archive entry in real time as the operation executed. She did not wait for confirmation. She did not consult with her supervisor. She simply began the process of documenting what she had found and what it meant. Analysis of human technology reports spanning 30 cycles reveals systematic and sustained underreporting of weapons platform development, fleet construction, and logistical architecture. The classification committee reviewed each report and marked them as minor significance. The underlying research indicates a doctrine of restraint-under-capability, the deliberate choice to build something of overwhelming power, and then to report only the minimum specification required to satisfy procedural review. This doctrine appears to have been in place for 30 years. The operation executed at 47-minute duration on this date appears to be the culmination of that doctrine, a demonstration that the capability existed, that it was positioned correctly, and that it would not be deployed except as a response to institutional violation. The archive records this for permanent remembrance. When the message came through, when the notification system signaled that the operation had completed, Kesmora did not celebrate. She simply saved the archive entry and moved to the next task, pulling the full research papers for permanent indexing. Because the most important thing the archive could do right now was be accurate. The emergency session was called within the hour. Dahl presided, but his patches had not returned to amber neutral. They remained in that unnamed color, the color of someone who had been forced to acknowledge that the architecture he had spent his entire career constructing was not actually holding what he had believed it was holding. 12 senior delegates presented arguments. The Varathi archive steward presented Kesmora's analysis. The Oreth conclave withdrew their objection to new charter language. The smaller species abstained from objection, which was the closest they could come to supporting something without antagonizing the Dominion further. The new charter was drafted in 11 hours. Dahl voted for it, because the alternative was worse, because procedure had failed, and the only way to acknowledge that failure was to build new procedure around the failure itself. The vote passed. The seal on every data slate in the chamber changed from gray to gold. Voss rose from her seat for the first time since the broadcast had begun. She gathered her materials with the same precision she had arranged them. She did not celebrate. She did not speak. She simply stood, set her data slate on the table with the seal facing up, and waited. When the chamber had cleared, when the delegates had filed out and the staff had begun the archival process, she remained. Thren approached her. "The notification came through," he said. "Everything is secure. We can move to the secondary location." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, "No, I want to sit here." "For how long?" "Until they notice I'm still here," she said. "That's the part that matters. The silence they tried to impose. I'm going to sit in it until the silence becomes something else." She sat in the Accord vault through the night cycle. No one stopped her. The chamber was designed for continuous session if needed. Environmental systems maintained the temperature. The lighting adjusted to a low amber that mimicked rest without requiring anyone to leave. Thren brought water, set it at her station, and left. He did not ask again. By the second hour, the cleaning staff simply worked around her. By the fourth, other delegates began to understand that she was not going to move. By the eighth, her presence had become a fact in the chamber. Not a protest, not a demonstration, just a woman sitting in the seat where she had been erased, with the gold seal in front of her, waiting. For what, no one asked. The question itself felt dangerous. Dahl did not sleep either. He sat in his quarters, a tiered chamber with traditional Thurvec architecture, the kind that showed a being's status through the number of vertical surfaces they could occupy, and accessed the real-time reports from the Dominion's affected sectors. All facilities secure, all personnel accounted for, all systems under human custody. He read the reports and understood, for the first time in his career, that procedure had never been the thing holding power in place. Procedure had only ever been the language that power used to describe itself. And now the language had changed. His chromatophore patches had not returned to amber neutral. They remained in that unnamed color, the color his medical advisors would later classify as persistent stress response, which was a technical way of saying he could not regain control of what his body was revealing. He accepted this. He would carry it. When he returned to the arbiter's seat, the council would see it, and they would understand that the moment of certainty had passed and would not return. Kesmora finished the archive entry at 07:43 Council Standard Time. The documentation was complete, 30 cycles of technology reports, cross-referenced with underlying research, the timeline of underreporting, the doctrine of restraint-under-capability, the 47-minute operation that proved everything the reports had implied. All of it permanent, all of it accurate. She saved it to the Deep Archive's primary index, not as a classified document, not as a restricted file, but as foundational historical record. The kind of entry that would be cited for centuries. The kind of entry that could not be revised or redacted. She did not celebrate. She returned to her station and began pulling the next set of documents that required analysis, because the archive never stopped, because accuracy was the only form of power that did not require a gavel to enforce. The next session convened at the standard time. Dahl returned to the arbiter's seat. His patches were still the wrong color. The entire council watched them and said nothing about what they saw. Sera Voss entered the chamber from the observation gallery. the path she would have taken if she had stepped outside to rest. She had not stepped outside. She had sat in her seat through the night cycle. Now she returned to that same seat, her data slate in front of her, the gold seal reflecting the chamber's formal lighting. She did not acknowledge the other delegates. She did not accept the gesture of recognition that a few of them attempted. She simply sat, hands flat on the table and faced forward. When Dahl called the session to order, he did so with the same procedural language he always used. The words were correct, but the sound of his voice was different. The delegates heard it. The archive recorded it. He opened the floor for the Charter Committee's final report. The new charter was read aloud. 47 minutes later, the same duration as the operation, which no one remarked upon but everyone noticed. The vote was called. The Thurvec Dominion voted in favor, because the alternative was worse, because refusing to accept the new reality would simply make the new reality permanent in a way that procedure could not contain. The vote passed. The seal on every data slate changed from gray to gold. Voss did not speak, not when the vote was called, not when delegates turned to look at her, not when Dahl, for the first time, called her name directly. Envoy Voss, do you acknowledge the new charter's ratification? She was quiet for a moment. Then she raised her hand to the recognition sphere, a gesture as old as the council itself, the formal acknowledgement of a delegate's presence. She lowered her hand. She did not speak. 3 weeks later, Voss rose during a session, the first time she had voluntarily broken her silence. A junior Thurvec delegate had raised a procedural challenge to a human resource allocation claim. It was routine. It was the kind of challenge that would normally require a response, a rebuttal, a counterargument made in the formal language of council procedure. Voss stood, the chamber quieted. She spoke so softly that every species in the chamber leaned forward to hear. We listened, she said. We are still listening. The archive is open. 4 sentences. The first one addressed what had happened. The second one addressed what would happen next. The last 2 acknowledged that the record itself was the response, not her words, but the permanence of what Kesmora had documented. She sat. She did not speak again for another month. The Thurvec fleet yards remained under human custody for 2 years. During those 2 years, Thurvec technicians worked alongside human crews. They maintained the yards. They built new ships under the protocols that the new charter required. They understood, gradually, that being treated carefully by the species you had tried to erase was a different experience than victory or defeat. It was witness. Some of them, years later, would describe that period as the most disorienting of their lives, not because they had been defeated, but because they had been evacuated safely from a situation that had every right to become a slaughter, and had not. Dahl kept his seat for 6 more years. His chromatophore patches never returned to amber neutral in a public session. They remained in that unnamed color, visible to every delegate, a permanent record of the moment he understood that certainty was not a feature of institutional architecture, but a vulnerability. When he finally retired, the record would show that he had managed 3 more treaty renegotiations, voted on 7 resource allocation disputes, and presided over the ratification of 2 new member species. All of it procedurally correct, all of it shadowed by the knowledge that procedure was not power. The younger Thurvec who studied his session recordings noticed that he had changed. Not his words, those remained technically perfect, but the silence around his words had changed. The silence had become heavier. Years later, a new analyst would pull Kesmora's archive entry and use it to argue for a reform of the classification committee's oversight procedures. The reform would pass. The protocol would be named after Kesmora, though she would decline any formal acknowledgement. She would continue working in the deep archive, continuing to document, continuing to ensure that the record was accurate, because that was the only form of power that did not require procedure to enforce. Because the archive was permanent, and the archive did not forget. Sera Voss would sit in the Accord Vault for another 9 years after the new charter's ratification. She would vote on 17 major initiatives. She would speak perhaps 30 times, each word chosen with the care of someone who understood that her silence was as significant as her voice. She would hold the human seat not as a victory, but as a presence. Not as a claim of power, but as a permanent reminder that power was not the only thing that mattered. On the day she stepped down, the day she handed the human delegation to her successor, she gathered her materials with the same precision she had used at every session. The data slate with the gold seal was the last thing she placed in her case. She did not look back at the chamber. She did not acknowledge the other delegates. She simply walked out the same way she had walked out months before, when the vote had silenced her. The archive had recorded every moment. The archive would hold it. The Accord Vault continued its sessions. New delegates came. Older ones retired. Species rose and fell in procedural influence. But the charter remained. The 3 simple rules remained. And in the deep archive, Kesmora's entry remained. A document that future analysts would cite when they wanted to understand the moment the Galactic Council learned that procedure was not the only language available. That restraint could be louder than any weapon. That the simplest, most dangerous act was to sit in the seat where you had been silenced and refuse to leave. The last image was of Sera Voss's data slate, resting on the desk of her successor. The seal was gold. It had been gold since the moment the new charter ratified, and it would remain gold, certified by every signatory in the chamber, held in place by the force of the record itself, unable to be revised or revoked because the archive had witnessed, and the archive was permanent. She had set it down with her hands flat on either side of it, the way she did when something was finished. And then she had walked into the silence and made it hers.